So this is a short video I wanted to put together, really just to start the boilerplate of kind of a bigger discussion about digital presentations and how they affect our kind of workflow in architecture school. Obviously, the idea now of presenting across the video monitor is becoming quite common, and there's some obvious nuances to this format that if we pay careful attention to, we can really kind of take advantage and optimize the results. And another consideration now, because of COVID and the pandemic, is the idea that our presentation is not just happening in a room, but it's also happening across screens. So the idea of what our format, what our presentation looks like when it's viewed remotely is an increasingly larger part of our concerns. And the idea of this format, digital monitors, is really ubiquitous from large presentations. This was a conference that I was at last year in the summertime. But the idea of the aspect ratios of the presentation screens, from overhead projections to room video monitors, they're all fairly consistent. And they need to be consistent so that instructors and presenters, when they go to new locations, are seeing common formats. And this is happening in the workplace also. So here's what's called a lunch and learn, an AIA session, where we would go into an architecture firm and present during lunch of some instructional material. And actually you can see up here kind of an error in this presentation we had. You can see the large black areas on both sides of the screen, indicating that we didn't really take full advantage of the real estate we had available to us for the presentation. In this case, the presentation that you're looking at is done in Google Slides. I find it to be really convenient because of the idea that it can be shared, it can be presented, it's readily available on the web, and it doesn't require, like PowerPoint, it doesn't require any other software. But that's really up to your own personal preferences, I think, on that. I took a few minutes to think about what happens for this specific presentation, what happens when we're looking at our presentations in a couple of formats. One is that we're just generally presenting. So in this case, you can see that the slideshow that we're looking at now, since I can't show you, because you'll be looking at video, I can't show you the edges of the screen. I took a screenshot of this to show you what the edges of the screen look like. And you can see how this fills the full frame of a 1920 by 1080 monitor, a common desktop computer monitor. And the other consideration is what happens when our presentation is being presented on a sharing platform, like in our case, Collaborate. So here we have Collaborate open with a screen sharing, and you'll notice it fills a large portion of the screen within the format of the full browser width. And if you go and get rid of the chat box, you'll notice how it expands to fit that scene also. So that setup happens when we make our page choice. And what's important about that is this consideration of aspect ratio. So here we have, this is an early kind of a graphic of aspect ratio because it ends at 1920 by 1080. But this carries forward, and I'll show you in the next slide. But the idea that thinking about this as a 16 by 9 aspect ratio, it could be 16 by 9 inches. In the case of a technical drawing, it could be 32 inches by 18 inches. But when we carry that aspect ratio, we're well assured that we're going to fit the most amount of our image into the available real estate available on the screen. And there's been a change in the industry. Early monitors and devices were not necessarily consistent to this kind of a ratio. And that's not any fault of early thinking. It's just that pixel counts and the ability to, or actually the desire to fit to multimedia and movie formats has become increasingly important. And like I say with that, the idea of even our phones have an aspect ratio that is close to that 16 by 9, if not exactly 16 by 9. And that allows us to view movies and other video content in its full recorded format. So I said that was a bit dated of a presentation of graphic resolution. And this is more of a modern screen. So here we have in the blue what would be a typical desktop monitor today, 1920 by 1080 resolution. and considered relatively good quality. We have desktop displays now that are much better than that. And then we're moving now very quickly, almost instantaneously, to now what is 4K resolution, which is really basically a doubling of the resolution and actually a quadrupling of the pixel count. So one of the things to take notice here is this red line that it is obviously indicating that each corner here is lining up. So the aspect ratio is exactly the same. So whether we have a 1080 resolution or a 2160, they will both fill the screen without leaving any black area on any of the sides. What's important also, just for this graphic, notice the blue area and realize that it's only 1/4 of the green area. This is the incredible amount of new resolution that's available at the 4K level, which is becoming readily, like I say, readily available. In any store you can buy a 4K monitor now in the 40-inch range for under $300. And we're going, just to keep us motivated on this idea of the possibilities of the digital format that we're moving into. This is just a little video clip. This is my wife at Home Depot a few years ago, I think it was, but a large digital display, and then the idea that you're actually to touch that screen and move through elements of it. And I can easily imagine this being us making project presentations, where you're actually discussing things and clicking through buttons, and your audience may, at the end of the presentation, be able to go back and interact with your actual presentation. But that's getting a little bit far afield for now. But we'll stay on that little far afield just for a moment, with the idea that we're really looking at a world of virtualization of our classrooms. This is a far off one. I think this is a Harvard experimental lab where it's full online teaching. The instructor is still in a classroom, but you can see the monitors and the no actual physical presence of the student. Now, for good reasons and bad reasons, obviously these people can be all over the world. They can be at all different times in their lives and have busy schedules and get together for certain activities. So this can be looked at as a really powerful experience or a threatening one to our conventional way of classroom activities. And here's a hybrid idea of that, just to make it a little more palatable maybe, an idea that here we have students both virtually experiencing a classroom lecture and in the room. And obviously this is taken pre-COVID because no mask and everyone is sitting very close to each other. On the technical aspects of the idea of this presentation, one of the things I wanted to also show you is I do as I flip to this slide, you'll notice that it slowly dissolves in. When we go to slide presentations, we have a lot of control over the way those images pop up on the screen. And I'll show you another example of that in a moment. But here, I wanted to point out this 3840 pixels, typically a 4K resolution. If you thought it needed to be, printing sharpness at 150 dots per inch, or it could be PPI, that would be the equivalent of a 25-inch wide sheet of paper. So we have a huge amount of information that we can display on our screens now. And in this case, this is a Revit document. And one of the things I wanted to point out was the easy way of importing these images in a way that can really blend well with our graphics. So one of the things I want to impress upon us as a group is the idea of exporting things as PNG files as opposed to JPEG. And that allows for the export of transparency, and that allows for these nice blends to our slide presentation or our backgrounds. And PNGs typically are a little bit larger in file size, but one of the nice advantages of them is they render straight lines and line weights of technical drawings very well. So keep in mind using PNGs. Keep in mind this 3840 as a sampling rate for the way you export images. And you can do all kinds of exports with that. In this case, it's a Revit document, and I'll go right out to Revit with this. But once again, a front elevation with PNG alpha channel transparency. And if we go out to Revit, here's that exact building elevation in a format where I can now go ahead and render that. And obviously, let me just cancel that off. And as you'll notice, I've set the background for transparent, so that allows that background to show. If you don't desire to do that, you can obviously save that as sky or whatever. But pay careful attention here to this idea of the resolution. At 5,000 pixels, this is really oversampled. We might want to actually decrease the resolution here a little bit to bring our pixel count down. That'll make our file size smaller and render faster. And I'll just do an experimental render here, because I want to get to the idea of how we actually can capture these images for use in presentations. They're all missing textures that I don't have in this sample file. And once this completes off, and you'll notice this checkerboard in the background, it's a typical standard for indicating alpha channel transparency. And we have an export function that's available to us. We're going to be exporting this at 2,000 pixels. The file size is actually uncompressed, is really quite large. We're going to go ahead and export this. It's going to come up on another screen, but I really wanted to just point out to you that the idea here is that we're exporting it as a PNG file. Now for file size management, you may want to consider re-importing this into Photoshop and then doing some sampling control over the PNG file to actually reduce the final file size. But that's not really a subject of this discussion. I wanted to just make something relatively quickly, so I'll keep moving here. So once that's been established, you can import that into your file. And one of the final things to get you thinking about digital presentations is they're not just static presentations. They can also be animated. In this case, this is from a BIM presentation that I picked up off of LinkedIn. And I thought it was really cool that if you step through the slides, what you're looking at are different slides, but you don't see anything else changing on the screen but the image. And that gives it the appearance of actually being animated. And so it would be very easy to have a discussion about phasing of a project, elements within a project, and be able to quickly move back and forth through this to describe certain kinds of elements. You know, like for instance, focusing on this kind of structural element in what looks like a lecture hall, or the early plans of how much site disturbance needs to be done. In this case, it doesn't look like there's any foundations built for the building. It's all at grade footers, and so you know, very little site disturbance could be discussed. You could tell the client what to expect at different times of the construction process, and well, anyway, a really delightful way of describing a project as it goes forward. So I'll conclude this start of the boilerplate of the presentation, and I'm hoping to expand this as I get comment back.